International reaction to Canada's decision to recognize a Palestinian state and claims that Israel is trying to starve Gaza. Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. You heard the announcement from Prime Minister Mark Carney last week. Canada will go ahead and recognize a Palestinian state, well, with certain conditions, he said, and it will happen this coming September.
For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the state of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state.
Now, there's widespread support in some circles for this, but not everywhere. Elon Levy is a man who knows Canada well. He's been an official and unofficial spokesperson for Israel since the October 7th attacks, and he joined me from Tel Aviv to discuss how he and many in Israel are viewing this move. So, Elon, your first reaction when you heard from the mouth of Mark Carney that Canada was going to join France and Britain in recognizing a Palestinian state?
I was truly staggered that Canada would give Hamas a reward for the October 7th massacre and encourage more barbaric atrocities against Israelis. And let's be clear, that's exactly what is happening here. The world leaders who say they will recognize a non-existent Palestinian state in a response to the October 7th massacre are encouraging Palestinians to think of October 7th as independent state. They're telling them that terrorism works. And really shocking that world leaders who want to end this war and bring lasting peace are instead condemning us to everlasting war. Because these world leaders, including Mark Carney, are giving Hamas absolutely no reason to end this war and free the hostages. On the contrary, they're giving Hamas every incentive to keep this war going, to keep holding onto the hostages, because Hamas knows the pressure will be turned up on Israel and not where it belongs, on the jihadi group that started this war and refuses to release the hostages.
Well, the July 21st communique signed by Canada and 26 other countries, including France, the UK, Spain, Poland, Ireland, the list goes on, where the foreign affairs ministers of each of those countries signed on condemning Israel, not even mentioning Hamas. That was put out, and almost immediately thereafter, the talks in Doha broke down. Now you've got Britain, France, and Canada all saying we will acknowledge a Palestinian state, and the renewed talks that were supposed to be taking place have now broken down. This really is saying you don't have to do anything at the negotiating table, Hamas. You just leave it to us and we'll set you up.
It's worse than that. Those foreign ministers actively sabotaged the negotiations at a critical point. Israel and Hamas were reportedly on the brink of a ceasefire agreement. And then the foreign ministers stepped in, condemned Israel, turned up the pressure on Israel, and Hamas hardened its demands. It started demanding the release of terrorists who took part in the October 7th massacre, and they blew up the talks. This is student politics we're seeing from world leaders who thought that they should pressure Israel instead of pressuring the side that was refusing a ceasefire. But let me tell you what I found especially staggering about Mark Carney's statement. It wasn't just that he said that recognizing a Palestinian state was in response to October 7th. Acknowledging the link to terrorism, oblivious that he is encouraging terrorism. It was the sheer arrogance of Mark Carney's statement. Because he said in that statement that he's conditioning recognition of a Palestinian state on a commitment to general elections next year in which Hamas can play no part, saying Hamas can have no role in the future governance of a Palestinian state. But Brian, Hamas is the most popular Palestinian party. According to Palestinian polls, it would win a landslide if elections were held today. In a head-to-head presidential election between Hamas leader Khaled Mashal and Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas, Hamas would absolutely crush its rivals. So the West here is overlooking the root cause of the conflict, which is that the Palestinian national movement still opposes Israel in any borders whatsoever. Their goal is one Arab Islamic State from the river to the sea, as people are chanting on the streets of your country. And when people ignore that, when people fail to understand Hamas's ideology, they fail to understand that the only way we can have lasting peace is if this war ends with Hamas losing, knowing it's lost, and serious de-radicalization on the Palestinian side, so that they abandon this failed strategy of continuing to wage jihad against Israel, hoping that Israel will be destroyed one day. They were trying to achieve lasting peace. In their naivety, they've condemned us to everlasting war.
Well, in many ways, I would say, especially over the last week, but in general, Israel has been losing the PR war, the social media war, the media headlines war. And that became evident with the New York Times piece that showed the image of a child claiming it was starving when no, this was not the case. You've been down at the food distribution centers. There has been incredible pressure on Israel because of the claim that Israel is stopping aid from going in. You've been there, you've witnessed it. What did you see that the world didn't, because most of the media will not bother to look or report facts that aren't first approved by the Gaza Ministry of Health, aka Hamas?
And one of the main pillars in the propaganda war against Israel has been these allegations of famine or using hunger as a weapon of war. And we've been hearing it for the last 22 months, UN agencies crying wolf, and it never happened. But now there is a serious hunger crisis in Gaza, and we need to understand why. There's a hunger crisis because Hamas is continuing to wage this war, to divert aid, to loot it, and because UN agencies, their mechanism has completely broken down. I'll tell you what I saw in Gaza this week. I went in on Sunday to the Kerem Shalom crossing to see the piles of aid that are rotting in the sun because the UN is not picking it up. I'm talking as far as the eye can see, mountains of hummus beans and canned tuna and oil and pasta and lentils that the UN is failing to pick up. Israel is letting aid into Gaza now faster than the UN can pick it up. And nearly all of the aid that the UN picks up gets looted along the way. Don't take my word for it. Look at the UN's own database that says that 90% of the trucks they pick up are not reaching their destination. They're being looted on the way, whether by Hamas or by other armed actors. The UN system isn't working. You know what is working? Israel's effort, together with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American company, to try to get aid directly to the people who need it. The US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was there with the Ambassador Mike Huckabee just a few hours ago, as the GHF announced it had distributed over 100 million meals inside Gaza. And that's the challenge. How do you get food to people who need it and make sure that it can't go to Hamas? Because Hamas has been able to hijack it, to divert it, to tax it, and make an absolute fortune that is allowing it to finance this war and to carry on. That's why Hamas is demanding, as part of the ceasefire deal, that aid not go through the GHF and only go through the UN, because it knows it's a broken mechanism that it can exploit to enrich itself. But you know, Brian, the real question is not how much aid is going into Gaza or how it's distributed around Gaza. It's the fact that as long as Hamas remains inside and underneath civilians, whatever aid, whatever supplies you let in are going to end up enriching Hamas. And the debate that real humanitarians need to be having, who genuinely want to help civilians, and helping civilians means freeing them from Hamas rule and ending its tyranny, is the question of how you separate civilians from the Hamas terrorists to make sure that Hamas cannot exploit those supplies in order to keep prolonging a war that should have ended a long time ago.
How do you expect things to play out over the coming months as we head towards that September meeting of the UN General Assembly, where there will be more pressure, where there will be international calls, where people who aren't paying attention will say, oh, well, the United Nations says, therefore it's good. You've got this PR war over food distribution. You've got this PR war that you've been fighting since October 7th as a spokesperson, official and otherwise, for Israel. How do you push back in the face of this, or is that side of it just lost? And even if eventually Israel physically defeats Hamas, they will be strong politically because of their ability to harness social media and gullible Westerners?
Yeah, Israel is winning the battle on the ground, but let's be clear that what is happening, the battle that's being fought out on TV screens, is exactly what Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar wanted. He was not only willing, he wanted to sacrifice his own civilians on the altar of jihad and create images of suffering that would cause cracks between Israel and its Western allies and lead Western allies under intense domestic political pressure to take actions that will in fact make this conflict worse, like what they're doing now when they blew up the ceasefire talks. This was Hamas's plan all along. That's why Hamas spent years preparing for this war by digging a network of military tunnels, longer than the New York subway, underneath people's feet, fighting from those tunnels with the shafts poking out inside homes and schools and hospitals in order to create images of suffering that would cause cracks between Israel and its Western allies. And I'm afraid the West has fallen into that trap. Because at exactly the moment that we needed to turn the screws on Hamas to accept a ceasefire and release at least some of those poor hostages who are shackled and tortured under Gaza, they decided to put up pressure on Israel. And that's prolonging this war. So now I think there are only four scenarios for where we can move forward. One, maybe the least likely, is the possibility of a temporary ceasefire. It's what Israel and the United States were pushing for, a 60-day ceasefire, get half the hostages out, negotiate on how to end the war. I don't think there's any chance of that anymore. Hamas has no reason to want a temporary ceasefire, thanks to Mark Carney and his friends. Another option is to try to negotiate a permanent end of the war. But that depends on Hamas being willing to relinquish power. Because if it doesn't, any reconstruction of Gaza means the reconstruction of Hamas. And if it doesn't relinquish power, no Arab force is going to want to take responsibility when you've got 20,000 Hamas terrorists running around with guns. So it's not clear there's an option to end the war either. There is another option, which is Israel decides to go all in into the areas of Gaza it hasn't touched, because that's where the hostages are. Say it's going for full military conquest of Gaza, but that's very dangerous and risky. And the IDF chief of staff is reportedly saying, look, this is going to endanger the hostages. This puts their lives in danger because their Hamas captors have instructions to put a bullet in their head if we get anywhere close. And then there is another option, which I wonder whether is being discussed in policy circles, which is to try to freeze the war. Instead of going further into Gaza, but definitely not retreating, saying Israel controls 75% of the Gaza Strip now. And if Hamas wants Israel to withdraw from any of that territory, it's going to have to give back hostages. Those hostages cannot remain trapped in the dungeons of Gaza any further. And by the way, I have to say, it's a tragedy that we've reached this point. Just this week, we saw all the countries of the Arab League condemning the October 7th massacre, calling Hamas to release the hostages and lay down its arms. And I'm asking, where were you for the last 22 months? You've finally come around to accepting the legitimacy of Israel's war goals after Hamas's invasion on October 7th. Imagine how much suffering could have been avoided if Hamas's Qatari patrons had said 22 months ago that Hamas must release the hostages. But they left it too little, too late, and as a result, Hamas feels emboldened to continue this war, and we need global pressure on Hamas and its patrons now. It's game over. Gaza is not going back to Hamas rule. The hostages have to be let out.
And the Arab League denouncing Hamas and putting pressure on them after Canada and other Western countries decided, no, the pressure should be on Israel. Do you have any final thoughts, Elon, for Canadians who are not following this as closely as I might, but who are sympathetic to Israel, but wondering as they look at the headlines, what they should feel, what they should support? Final thoughts for them.
You know, yesterday, Islamic Jihad, Hamas's allies in Gaza, released a hostage video of a young hostage called Ron Braslavsky. He looks like a hollowed skeletal shell of a human being, shaking, sobbing, begging for his life, writhing on the floor, untreated injuries, saying he can't bear to be there anymore and begging to be rescued. And this is a sophisticated propaganda video that they're filming in a tunnel deep underground with hostages we know are being shackled. Their hands and legs are shackled and they're not being fed properly. And the hostages are a basic humanitarian cause. It's not about politics. It's not about left and right. It's not about pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Hamas should never have taken the hostages in the first place. And this war can only end when all the hostages are free and when Israelis are confident that Hamas can never take hostages again. Because we just can't take the risk of an armed jihadi terrorist group invading, marching straight into people's homes, into their living rooms, into their bedrooms, snatching children from their beds, snatching young people from a music party, and abducting them into tunnels in Gaza. That can never, ever happen again. That's why this war has to end with all the hostages home and with Hamas never again free to take hostages again.
Elon, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you, Brian.
A lot to think about, a lot to unpack, and of course, much of the media is only giving you one side of the story, not us. Let us know what you think. Drop a comment down below, share this on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.